ways that the system could be gamed. I mean, if you can break into what is supposed to be a tight electronic voting system, couldn't you just as easily break into a system that allows you to print out a ballot and send it in? You could break into almost any system and tell people to send things places they shouldn't be sending them.
So I think there's a distinction we have to make between online ballot return, which is the focus of our conversation, where you were, it's a true online voting system where you're receiving a ballot on your computer and sending it back through a website or through the internet. And other kinds of systems that involve the internet, either to send voters a ballot in advance of the election that they can print out and mail back, or systems where after the election you can check that your paper ballot was received by going to a website. These systems, the systems that involve sending your ballot back over the internet, are much more dangerous than the other kinds of systems, because in this case there is one centralized repository of computer systems that is the server that's accepting the votes. And this is the target with the bullseye point painted on it for anyone who wants to try to compromise the voting system. This is the sweet spot for your attackers. In systems where you're printing out a ballot, say, and sending it back through the post, people might try to tamper with it by changing the address or changing the ballots and so forth, but this is something that's going to be fairly easy to detect after the fact, because some voters you're going to have some fraction of voters notice that the address is wrong perhaps, or you're going to be receiving ballots that are incorrect, and you can then investigate why. In order to divert or compromise ballots on their way, you have to attack the Postal Service, which, although certainly not perfect, is a very distributed system with no central point of compromise like the vote receiving server. So there are ways to attack these other forms that don't involve delivering the ballots back home online, but those attacks are much harder to carry out and much easier to detect than attacks against a centralized voting server for online ballot return.
I'm wondering, Ron, if you can address a question that we have here. A lot of the concerns that we're hearing about the security of software systems are true of things like ATM machines, which all the time, now when I punch in my code, it says I should cover my hands over my code because people are watching, they're spying on me. People are worried about security. What's the difference between security and online voting and, say, going to my ATM?
That's a great question, and one, because that analogy is brought up a lot of the time. And voting is fundamentally different in character than online banking. With a banking system, you get a statement back every month saying, what happened to your account. And you'll notice if somebody took an extra $100 out of your account somewhere, you'll say, well, that's not a withdrawal I made somewhere. You get, there's a closed loop there. You can verify what's going on because you're in continual communication with the bank about what's happened. There's audit trails and paper trails all over the place, and you're in the loop about to see what's going on. With a voting system, it's not like that, right? Because we have a secret ballot in this country, that means at some point the link between you and your ballot has to be broken. That you need to be casting an anonymous vote. The vote counting system is counting anonymous ballots, and if the votes are changed after they gain that stature of anonymity, there's typically no way for you to tell, or anybody to tell. You just have to trust that hasn't happened. So it's a fundamentally different kind of set of system requirements here. Banking is a closed loop kind of system where you get the feedback, you can see what's going on. Voting is not like that because you need to make your ballot anonymous. It goes into a pile of anonymous ballots. And that's the fundamental qualitative difference.
I want to add, please go ahead to that. The banks report that they lose up to 2% of their electronic transaction revenue due to electronic fraud, up to 2%. But they're saying, well, it's the cost of doing business. I mean, we're still making profit. I think that accepting such losses due to fraud in election is not acceptable. Accepting this for business reasons, if you're still making profit, is fine, of course. I also want to add, of course we're all using ATMs, but suppose you were forbidden to count the cash. Would you ever use this ATM? I don't think so. And so with paper money, there is some recourse. You can count and you can say something went wrong. With paper ballots, again, whether they're delivered electronically or they delivered physically in person at an election center, there is a recourse, which is the count of the voter verified paper trail.
As you look at a system like Connecticut, where we have 169 towns and cities, all these communities, everyone running their own elections, what added problems do you think that puts into the question of internet voting when you have municipal elections? And right now our system it's very decentralized.
So currently we do audits. And the auditability of election systems, whether electronic or standalone, I think is an extremely important aspect that is now not being addressed by any system that I know available commercially. If the system is not auditable, then basically you trust the vendor that the votes were counted correctly and that nothing wrong went on. So I would certainly require that, from my perspective, that if any system, actually any new system deployed, whether it is online or standalone, that it is designed to be auditable. And in Connecticut, of course, we do two types of audits. We do random recount, and we also do the technological audit, where we select the programming from the machine before and after each election, and we check that the programming is consistent with the election, that there are no events that are inconsistent with the proper conduct of an election, and that there is no malicious code in the machines. So auditability, I think, is a prerequisite.
We have a question from someone in the audience for Secretary Tennant. So why has West Virginia not yet adopted internet voting statewide? And could you estimate the cost for internet voting statewide in West Virginia for, say, a federal election?
That's a good question. Well, 2010 was a federal election year for the pilot project that we did. It was just a pilot project, and this is what we told the legislature, that we would come back with reports, and it's an ongoing process for us. It's an ongoing process in terms of working with other entities like IEEE or NIST or FVAP, which is the Federal Voting Assistance Program, or Pew. And this is what we want. It's not set in stone for West Virginia. This is the type of discussion and debate we want, and this is what we work for, is to be able to show some real world success, because I haven't given you all the detail. We didn't have one server. We had two servers. We had different areas where, and in two different vendors for that case. And so we continue to work with our county clerks and continue to discuss this with folks on a national level as well. And when the funding comes into place, what we used was actually for, Susan talked about the vendors wanting to make money. A couple of vendors did this gratis and did the primary and general election for free for those counties in which they were.
I bet if you did it statewide, they wouldn't do it for free.
Well, I know they wouldn't, but that becomes into play. What kind of funding do you have? We use some HAVA funds, and HAVA is Help America Vote Act, which was passed in 2002, but we don't have those funds that are continuous and ongoing, and that just becomes part of the debate. That's part of what Secretary Merrill and the lawmakers here in Connecticut are considering too.
Well, how did you vet the vendors that you used, and did you have public hearings in advance? How did that work?
We did not have public hearings, but they were required to meet several guidelines that were put into legislation. And an important part that ALEC saw was that third-party observers, they had to agree that there would be third-party observers if we use them as security, the vendor support, ballot security, platform compatibility, data integrity, and we just had a checklist of things that the vendors had to meet in doing this.
May I ask?
Please, go ahead. Yeah.
What did the third-party observers observe?
We did not have, they had the opportunity to observe, but we did not have third-party observers in use. But had they.
What would they have had the opportunity to observe?
I can't give you the technical details, Professor.
But I wanted to add that one important item that you didn't mention yet is that that there was an a priori requirement that the vendor releases their system for evaluation by independent analysts. And I think that is still an option prior to broader deployment of the system after the pilot.
Well, yes, we don't have this in place now.
I realize that, but this is, did the vendors actually agree to that? I mean, did they?
Yes.
I'm actually surprised and pleased that the vendors are becoming more cooperative in this regard, because normally they do not want you to touch any of the software at all. So.
I wonder, Ron, are we going to jump in?
Thanks, yeah, I wanted to follow the line.
Just very quickly, Ron, you just jump in, yeah.
Yeah, I think the word auditability that Alex brought up is a wonderful word, and we ought to be emphasizing it here. Paper ballots are auditable in a way that electronic systems aren't. I wanted to ask Secretary Tennant, right, Venture Law Secretary Tennant, about the following scenario. I mean, I worry a lot when I see the outsourcing of the trust that we should have in our government process to outside vendors. And we're doing that in a big way here when you're talking about the kind of process you have in mind. I mean, if it were the case that these vendors had corrupt insiders, or that their servers had been taken over by the Chinese somehow, I would claim that you have no way of knowing. And the results you got from that process was corrupt, and you didn't know. Is that possible?
And you're saying,
what process did you have in place?
So you're questioning the integrity of a vendor?
I'm saying that if the vendor process was corrupt,
correct.
What processes do you have in place to correct the vote count?
Not just in internet voting, but I'm with you in all of that.
Right.
I don't like the idea.
Recounting statistical samples of paper ballots.
But I can't make election machines myself. So I use a vendor to make these election machines, and then they're programmed by someone in West Virginia.
You're trusting the vendor to do the counting for you.
But that's a question I wanted to get to.
That's what's happening in what other machines, what other type of voting machines, we do
No,
that in other
that's
voting
not
machines
the
as
process
well.
that I favor. Would be
Exactly.
one where anytime you've got a complex thing going on, run by a machine or an outsider or something like that, you've got a way of checking their work. And with paper ballots counted by optical scanners, you can take statistical samples and you can recount them by hand. And so you don't trust the software on the scanner. I don't know how to do that for internet voting, right? I mean, not in the same way. So we have an auditability requirement here that you can meet with paper ballots, even though they're counted by machine for efficiency. And you're not putting the trust in the vendor that supplied the machine.
Right, and
But
you're
the
putting
process you're
trust
talking
in human
about,
beings also in a poll
Yes, in
worker
an
as well. And if
observable
you're
process.
saying that there's a scheme within the vendor, there could be a scheme within human nature of as simple as the lead under the finger type of.
I place my bets on an observable human process counting paper ballots. That's correct. Yes.
So, we have the highest standards probably in West Virginia as in any other state when it comes to all of our election systems, not just for this pilot project that we did, but for all. And in asking what the third party observer could do, the vendor would have to allow an independent third party to monitor the review, the software before and during the election, and the procedures of how many people have access to what parts of the system, how the passwords are issued, and how the backups are done too. We also had that separated as well among key election officials within those counties.
But I think the point that Ron is making about auditability is that simply looking at the voting system from the outside, which is what those kinds of observability features are, sort of looking at what the vendor says the software is and what it does, looking at what passwords they've chosen. That's not the same as observing the process of counting the votes. That's still going on inside the computer, driven by hardware and software that you can't actually see. And the kinds of software tampering and the sophisticated attacks that we've seen increasingly in recent years would not be detected by that kind of observation. What you need to do in order to actually detect modern sophisticated attacks is have a system that can be externally observed by real people while it's going on, where you're not trusting hardware, software, computer systems to be behaving correctly. That's what paper ballots and optical scan with appropriate auditing procedures gives you, and it's what internet voting does not.
We have a couple of questions coming in from people in the audience, and so maybe I'll put this to Susan, and this is something that I frankly know very little about myself, but some people on our panel I'm sure do. A question about online voting systems used in Europe, including Estonia, they've written here, or Australia. Do these differ in any major ways from those in West Virginia? What do you know about places around the world that use internet voting?
That's a really complicated question because they're all different, and a lot of countries are experimenting with these things or using them fully. Estonia is a good example, Norway, Switzerland. A lot of them are the same vendors that are over here now, by the way. I can't really answer that question in detail. I can just say that we've had debates on this topic, and you know, a lot of the issue is in the nature of the country and the people. How much does the average American trust their election official compared to the average Swiss person, who might maybe just do what they're told a little bit more than what we do? So there's the other thing is, you know, there are more centralized systems, and for example, in Estonia, I don't think that in a very small regional area you have 169 different election jurisdictions. If you go to Wisconsin, you have 1,850. Here it's only 169, but it's still a pain. So we are so distributed in this country. We involve so many people in so many different locations, and there's such a huge amount of redundancy. Versus in Estonia, it's a smaller country. They can say, okay, all of you are going to pay for this card for your ID. You all have your government issued ID, of course, but this is a special card that allows you to vote, and you are going to pay for the hardware that gets attached to your computer, and you are going to be able to vote with these two things together, etc., and follow these guidelines, and everybody just
You have to pay for it?
Yeah, so they're cultural issues along with the implementation of these systems.
That's something we don't do here. The Swiss may stand in line, but we don't pay to vote.
Yeah, well, let me tell you, the Swiss don't trust their voting system. I live right next door to them.
Well, actually, Switzerland, didn't they conduct a national referendum on online voting, and it passed with over 70%
Is it
support?
conducted online?
The next one will be, probably.
I mean, in Germany, they outlawed it. It's constitutionally not allowed to have opaque voting, which basically internet voting is. In the Netherlands, they implemented it all, and it was, you know, things like, you know, online stuff was going on and e-voting, and they yanked it all out. In Norway, they have, I think they were, I don't know, but it's all over the map. The truth is that, you know, this is early days.
Well,
They're
Alex,
cutting
yeah.
their teeth on it. Maybe we wait and we take advantage of it later. In our country, we have razor-thin margins on our elections. 2%, like the bank failure, that's too much.
Well, Alex, go ahead. Yeah.
So just to add and re-emphasize it to what Susan just said, other countries do sometimes have different requirements and different constraints about how the election processes work. And sometimes it's not a fully secret ballot, for instance, which simplifies it quite a bit. And in many countries, the margins, especially, or a victory, are much bigger, and so a small amount of fraud by a small number of for a small number of internet voters doesn't matter very much. But the system we hear most about, the one in Estonia, I do not believe is secure. So that is my professional pronouncement so far. I have to reserve judgment on certain other systems that I know less about.
Have you spoken with anybody in Estonia about this?
I have talked to some people in Estonia about the system.
Yeah. You brought up something, Ron, a couple of times, this idea that an attack could happen and we wouldn't know that it happened. I think that's something that maybe you could address a little bit more, because it's one thing when perhaps we might know that something has been tapped into and something has been changed, but something entirely different if it was hidden so well that we had no idea that many votes have been changed or many names have been compromised, for instance?
Yeah, I think we're seeing a blossoming of computer attack techniques recently. There was one that made the press quite widely, the Stuxnet attack on the uranium enrichment plants. It's not known, at least publicly, who did this, but that was a very sophisticated attack that snuck by a long, complicated chain of email and USB port sticks and other things to work its way into the heart of the uranium enrichment plant. And they didn't know for a long time that this was a extremely sophisticated attack, probably done by some nation state or combination of nation states against the Iranian efforts. National elections in this country would be subject to the same kinds of adversaries. It's easy to imagine there would be foreign countries who might have units in them somewhere that would want to affect the US elections. And given the technology that's out there, given that you can go on the internet and buy what's called zero-day exploits for systems that have never been exercised before, you've got a left hook coming from who knows where into your system, taking it down. So, the fact that something may happen, you may never know it, is, and these days, a fact of life with working on the internet. You have computer systems which, even the NSA said recently, they presume that a certain fraction of their computers are compromised at this stage. And following along with these ideas of margins, I think it's important to realize that we're not just talking about putting foreign voters' votes at risks. The goal is to enfranchise foreign voters, and I fully support that. The kind of program that Susan's talking about is a great way to make that work well. But if you have an internet election that's compromised and those votes are flipped in some way, you're not just disenfranchising those voters, you're disenfranchising everybody else in the state of Connecticut. It's a Connecticut election, because all the voters who voted for the candidate who should have won, their votes no longer matter. Right? They've been overwhelmed by the internet voting. So it's a bigger risk scenario, risk equation than just a small number of voters who are voting over the internet. It's not just their votes that we're talking about here.
Alex Schwarzman, you brought up the number 100% before, and we've had a couple questions about this. In everything, we would love to have 100% accuracy. I was having a conversation beforehand with someone about voting perhaps being the one thing where we expect that everyone should be able to cast their vote, and it's unacceptable to have that 2%. But in your world of science, it's very, very hard to get anything to be 100%. Can we really look at a system of online voting or any type of voting and say it will be 100% safe?
Well, clearly, I agree that we should not shun technology just because it's not 100% safe. The exact margins of safety deserve study. I think that in the election business, we have to make sure that at least we're taking all steps to ensure that errors, if not completely prevented, but can be detected. And for this to happen, even without online voting, we need to better integrate participation from vendor community, from political structures, civic leaders, and academicians like ourselves, and jointly work on the problem. I think that in the past, this has been a problem, and this lack of cooperation. We, in the academic world, were too often known for hit and run kind of attacks. Not that we did it, but when systems were made available for evaluation, we would say, here's a problem, a severe problem, goodbye. And of course, the response of the vendors is that they're circling the wagons, and they do not want to let anybody see their software. And so it's even worse because most systems have not been thoroughly evaluated that are in use today. So making it a priori a requirement that any vendor system, as in West Virginia, is open for inspection by the experts is the first step. And we build on that.
We have a question from someone in the audience that says, as a young person and an active voter, I'm familiar about the lack of participation of those in my age group. Do you believe that having online voting would help to increase voter turnout of young adults? obviously we're talking about the technology that may or may not allow this to be safe. Many people, though, say the reason we're having this conversation in the first place is because people don't get involved in voting. If it was easier for them to vote, perhaps they would. You brought up this idea of participation. Susan, I'll go to you first. Do you think that online voting would have more people participate, not just overseas, but everywhere?
I think you've got a big trade-off. I mean, the minute you say put the election online and a lot of people vote and it's suddenly open to really tampering, okay? Massive fraud. Anyone who's worried about voter fraud, they ought to worry about it getting all the ballots on the internet, then you can totally undermine the democracy in one fell swoop. That's what will keep people from participating if they don't believe their votes are safe. I think even a young person can understand that. There are limits to what we should do or what we are. We can use the internet all over the election process. There are so many wonderful things you can use the internet for and web applications. I spend day and night creating those things. And it improves the process. I think everybody's capable of understanding that this one part of it may not be secure. Young people see all those reports. They see all the cybersecurity attack reports. They'd probably think we were stupid not to pay attention to that. And yeah, it might be easier, but what's the trade-off here? You lose faith. You can't get it back.
Hey, John.
You thought about that quickly, and then I'll get to you.
So this is an empirical question as to how technology changes affect voting turnout. And my understanding, and I'm not the expert on this area, I'll admit, but my understanding is that there are really three kinds of voters. There's the voters that are committed voters, and they will vote no matter what kind of technology you put in front of them. There are voters who will never vote because they don't care, and it doesn't matter what kind of technology you make available. And there's a small percentage of voters who are sunny weather voters. They'll vote if the weather's sunny, they can conveniently make it to the poll station and do whatever. So the swing in terms of voter participation based on technology is not large. That's been the historical experience so far with different kinds of technology introductions. The idea of increasing participation by just playing with the technology as opposed to doing other things like increasing the extent to which voters are informed about the issues, I think is a chimera, and we really ought to be focusing on those other things. Internet voting may have some impact. That's, again, an empirical question that I don't know, but I think that's dubious given the historical record so far with electronic voting at the poll site, et cetera.
John, I understand where folks are coming from, and I don't want people to think that, I'm just throwing this all aside. We're going to do this, and we're going to try this. I just work on my information and on my data. I felt very secure, and even as Alec has talked about, in what we expected and demanded from the vendors. But then ultimately it comes down to who I'm serving, and it's the voters, and it's the military voters, especially that this was targeted to. And this is what I continue to say, why we need to examine it. And someone asked, well, why doesn't West Virginia have it as a whole? That's part of the reason, because we're still examining it. We're still looking at it. We're looking for ways to make it better, that we all can meet common ground and we all can come together to make this happen. And whether it's 20 years or 15 or 10 years, we are seeing it happen. It did happen in West Virginia. And these are the things that resonate in my head, and why I'll continue to sit up here and take the attacks and take the arrows and have the criticisms on the blogs and be called names and things like that, because it's notes like this that I get back. And I could even read you a longer one, but I know reading is not good on radio, right?
Well, we're on television too.
Okay, well good, I can look at the camera then too. A major in the United States Army from Marshall County, West Virginia. This is what he wrote back for his feedback. I want to emphasize and stress having the ability to vote online is very much appreciated by this service member as well as others. Having the ability to quickly and easily exercise our right to vote in the military is paramount, along with ensuring that we can partake in the voting process while separated from traditional means of voting. I think that that's very important too. This is one of the normalcy or the traditional feelings that military folks can have when they're in the middle of a combat zone. While mailing in a vote or other means are still available, having this option, online voting, makes this process that much easier for military members. That was from after our May primary election, and I have Now, I could read you even more about my husband who is over at Camp Edgar's in Kabul trying to help out folks. And Susan will talk about how easy it is. Not when you're there, it's not easy. He is looking and he's going and asking for a voting assistance officer. And I know we're getting real detailed in the military, but that's the expertise that I bring from this experience of online voting. And from what I understand, it might be Connecticut's question, even if we could just serve the military and putting them on the pedestal. But he's at Camp Edgar's, and you're supposed to have a voting assistance officer at every base where you're located. He's going around asking for them. And in turn, the military, the DOD, should be the ones who are looking and searching out the voters, the military voters, and that certainly wasn't the case.
Well, you mentioned the military once again, so I'll go to another question that someone has, and this reads, security is the most important aspect of this discussion. Is this to say that there are no secure networks anywhere? Military and government agencies, this person writes, have secure networks. Is it out of the realm of possibility of having a secure network like that with locations overseas to vote on, or I'll just add, even right here in Connecticut? Can you make a secure network for the military or anyone else?
Well, the military does have dedicated networks for handling things like classified information and so forth. And if you run a voting system on that sort of network, you do get some advantages. For instance, it's no longer directly accessible from other foreign countries that might want to attack our voting system. On the other hand, you have some disadvantages. The system of delivering the votes is not a system that's delivering and counting the votes isn't one that's under civilian control anymore, which raises other sorts of political and policy questions. But whether any of these networks are 100% secure, almost certainly not, because that's not a level that we're able to reach. There are cases where these things are breached. But comparing relative risks, partitioning it off and doing voting for military service members entirely within the military secure network would reduce the attack surface. Robert?
We could add to that, yeah, and it's not just the network. I mean, the internet is a collection of networks, but the weakest spots in the whole proposed system are the laptops or whatever that are used to cast the vote at the remote voters side, and the servers that are back at the election officials side. Those are much more juicy targets and much more vulnerable to simple attacks usually. So I think that having, it's not just the network, and the problem of identifying the voter securely is another big part of this too, right? So it's not the network, but it's who's using the network, who's pretending to cast a vote in my name. What basis does the the server have for authenticating the votes that are cast? Unless you've got other channels outside of the internet, most of these can be pretty easily just sort of sideswiped. A man-in-the-middle attack takes care of these pretty well.
If we can try, in the last little bit of time we have left, to think about how we might design a system that was more secure. Do we start with something like a closed military-style system for the entire country? Again, I don't know who controls it, but do we have to start somewhere with a closed system that's outside the traditional internet?
I think, frankly, the thing you have to do if you want to secure a system for online voting is wait. Because in order to solve the problems that we're facing, these things like ensuring the availability, protecting the system against intrusions on people's clients, these are some of the biggest open problems in computer system security. And it's going to be decades of research before we're able to solve them well. In the meantime, we have other technologies that can be used to make absentee voting easier, things like delivering the ballots online and letting people mail them back. And these technologies can serve us very well in the interim.
Rob?
I could add to that too. I think I would want to ask, what is the problem we're trying to solve? The way you phrased the question was, how can we make internet voting work? That's not the question we need to be solving as a country. The question we need to be solving as a country is, there are remote voters who are having difficulty or impossibilities voting. How can we spend our limited resources to allow them to vote securely in the best possible way? If the internet happens to be part of the solution, that's fine. But if it's not, that's where we should go. And I would assert that we need to be, we can platinum plate, our delivery services both ways to these remote voters and spend a lot less money and be a lot more sure of our voting than trying to use something flaky like the internet for those purposes.
And the only reason I ask is because the reason we might arrive at a question like, how can we make internet voting work, is that this tends to end up in legislatures where people ask questions like, how can I make internet voting work? They get calls from their constituents, they get letters from people who say this is something we wanted to try.
Yeah,
And then all
that's
of a
like asking
sudden-
what's the best way to skate on thin ice, right? I mean,
Well, but for the purposes of this, you know, if you are asked that by legislatures, by lawmakers, and the question is, how do we make it safe? I hear your point. Is there a way, that's what I just want to get at in the last little bit of time we have. Is there a way, you were saying no, not right now.
It's, as Alex says, it's a question of research. There is a vigorous community of researchers who would like to answer the question, what is the best possible way to vote using tools such as the internet? It is an interesting technical question. It doesn't mean that we should thereby adopt whatever answer comes up with, but we don't even know what the answer to that question is yet. You know, the ways in which the internet can be used are numerous, and there's questions of pairing the internet with other, with other mail channels or phone channels or other things too. So we don't know what the best ways of using the internet are yet for voting, and probably when we find out, we won't like them anyway. But I think we've got a long ways to go before we even know the answer to that question. Right now, we're just skating around on this thin ice and hoping that the ice doesn't break.
Susan, did you want to jump in on this question? If we're trying to solve this problem, I mean, do you have any ideas about how the problems, from your standpoint, we would need to solve to make internet voting work?
I'm going to go back and say, again, I think we're solving the wrong problem. I really think there is so much great technology available out there that is not implemented for Connecticut voters, and I'd like to see that it is, and it's safe. And it would hopefully, I think it would address some of the participation problems. There's so much technology out there. If technology was the only answer, we would see participation growing. But it isn't. It might even be going down. So what are the real problems that need to be solved? Why are voters not voting? Is it really a technology issue? I think it's more complex. But right now, there's tons of technology, great stuff out there that can make the voting process easier. I welcome the fact that it's on the internet. I think it's great, and we can use it without risk. And I think we can let some of these questions get answered before we take that one.
Alec, perhaps you could jump in?
Well, I'm not qualified to answer questions about why people are not voting, so that's not my area of expertise. But I will follow up on something that Ron mentioned is that it's not only the internet that is the problem, it's also the servers and the client machines from which and to which voting is going to be done. I will, and it's a hostile environment. Internet is a very hostile environment. I will mention that one of the very first systems we evaluated here in Connecticut, it was not designed for internet, but it was internetable. And we have found a very curious item on this machine. We, for example, found email from and to the designer of the machine. We know how much he was paid for the project. We know which house he bought with the proceeds. And we also know what art he enjoyed. And that's, that's...
Is he still alive? Is he still alive?
We lost track of him since we evaluated the machine. So it's being able to design clean systems and safe systems. You need to start from scratch, and tremendous amount of research is necessary. I think that Ron mentioned 20 years. I think that's a very reasonable starting point.
We had a question for Secretary Tennant. The Secretary said earlier that the vendors had permitted their systems to be tested in West Virginia. And the question is, would West Virginia permit an open testing period on its internet voting system like Washington, D.C. did? Would you invite the folks from Michigan to come down?
Well, that's the difference. I think that folks are misunderstanding a little bit about Washington, D.C., and I know that I've been misquoted about that. Remember, Washington, D.C.'s was an in-house, and from what I understand, they used an open source for the pilot. Correct, Professor? It was an open source, where ours was closed. Ours was from a vendor, and I don't have that proprietary right to open up what a vendor has done. Now we have a set of guidelines, and that's why this panel is just the start I believe, Secretary, if I could give you a little bit of advice, this is just a start. This is really just skimming the top. You're going to want to see some of the requirements that we ask and require of vendors, or you're going to want to see the legislation that we put in place. And so, to talk about Washington, D.C., I can't open it up. Now, I'm a former reporter, and I'm a very open public official. I'm all about open and engaging government. I believe that it's not my government, it's the people's government, and the more they know about it, the more that they will be involved in it. So transparency and accountability is very important to me, and what I do and what we do in the Secretary of State's office is very open. I just can't open up someone else's proprietary type of sources that they have, and that's why Washington, D.C. was different than West Virginia, because it was an open source, it was in-house, and ours was from two separate vendors.
What is so secret about the way their technology counts the votes that your vendor won't let the public know how it works?
It doesn't count votes? Correct, it doesn't count votes. We counted the votes.
Okay, but the way that it collects and delivers the votes, what is the secret part of that process that they feel is so proprietary that they can't share the inner workings of the machine with people who want to know what's going on?
I can't speak for them, but I can tell you what the open, I can sit here and read all the requirements that we ask for the vendor to have, the transparency and openness about the system's design. The function is how's it going to foster confidence among the voters, the independent third parties. I have a full list for you if you'd like to see that.
But you didn't require that they allow you to perform a public test?
We did public testing within the counties, and actually, when we did that testing, there was an inverted number, and it caught that. It caught that when it opened it up. So we did do public testing on this, and it was. As a matter of fact, I was at the OVF conference when that was taking place. So I remember that quite well. I wasn't there, but I know that I had the reports back to me. Right,
so in the future, would you, other than opening the source, which you, I understand you don't have the right to do because it's proprietary and the vendor wants to keep those details of the machine's operation a secret, would you in the future run a public trial where you invited members of the public to try to tamper with the mock election, as Washington, D.C. did?
I can't speak for what I would use with the vendor or we would do in-house or an open source. I can't speak to that right now.
I believe we're about out of time, and I'm just wondering if all of our panelists here might have just a few closing remarks, not too long, but after we tore through an awful lot of material here.